Let's turn now to our call of the day. Today, we're talking about Goldman Sachs' latest note on shares of Spotify. The firm reiterating its buy rating on the stock, but raising its price target to $280 per share. That's up from $205 previously. Shares of Spotify today at a record high, up some 9.7%, $266 per share. And Seana, this is, Goldman coming out and saying what a number of other firms have said when it comes to Spotify's recent acquisitions of the Joe Rogan catalog, their deal with Kim Kardashian, the deal with the DC Comics, and where Spotify might go in the podcast space. And I think that is all well known. It's surprising to me that Goldman coming out and raising their price target seems to be the marginal mover on the stock today, considering every analyst, it seemed like, had already weighed in, and everyone loves this strategy from Spotify. It's surprising to me how much momentum there's been behind the stock in news that's been known now, again, for about a month.
Yeah, but I also think that the fact that they continue to make these types of deals, this is something that Wall Street is getting more and more bullish on. And you're right, Myles, it's almost the exact same scenario and the exact same storyline that we talked about last week when we mentioned Rosenblatt raising their price target to $275. They were bullish on the podcast moves that Spotify is making. And here we have Goldman essentially saying the same exact thing. But I think overall, the takeaway here is just the fact that Spotify, by making these types of strategic deals with Joe Rogan, with Kim Kardashian, with The Ringer, they are attracting a loyal fan base to a lot of these, I guess, big players in this space, and a lot of potentially loyal listeners are widening their audience. And it's a great way to attract some of those new users. And the points that Goldman was making, they talked about the total addressable market, the fact that in the US, podcast listeners are expected to surpass 100 million this year. So it's a big audience for Spotify to target, so it can really help them grow here in the short term. Also, it will help them, this is according to Goldman, reverse their declining ARPU, which is their average revenue per user trends. So that obviously will be good news here for Spotify. And then also just serves as a differentiator to drive those music subscribers to Spotify. So if people are using if they're using Apple Music or any other applications or anything to listen to their music, they then will more likely go to Spotify. And I actually do agree with that. I mean, I've always been a Spotify listener just in terms of music, but I have started to listen to more podcasts on Spotify because it's just one destination. It makes it a lot easier for the user, and you have everything that you need right there. So I think this will help Spotify down the line. It's interesting though, and Myles, you pointed out the price of Spotify today, because when you compare it to what it is, what you said is over 260, it was at 262 last time I checked. I think right now it's at 266. Compare that to what it started the year, right around 150, dropped all the way to 117, 116. And now we're back up in the 260s. So from a valuation perspective, this stock is extremely expensive. So it is interesting to me that we're seeing so many of these calls to the upside when you're saying that, hey, the stock might actually be due for some sort of pullback here in the short term.
Yeah, and guys, just to jump in on Spotify, it's interesting to me that this Goldman note is pegged to the podcast stuff. And that makes sense because all the buzz lately around Spotify has been around its investments in podcasting. But what's interesting is you almost get the sense that some people are forgetting the core business. Now, of course, they're linked because the idea is, hey, if we buy up more in podcasting, we're going to gain new subscribers and pull more people. But let's also remember that, in my opinion, I think that Spotify is getting closer and closer to becoming, Myles, the thing you and I love to go back and forth on and play that game of brands that have become known as the generic version of the thing. So give me a Kleenex and you hand me a Puffs tissue, but you knew what I meant, a tissue. I was talking to a friend of mine who has her debut novel out, and she mentions music a few times in the novel. And I said, you know what you should do is a Spotify playlist to go with the novel. And she said, yeah, I'm doing one already. And then she posted it, and it doesn't use Spotify, but point taken. She knew exactly what I meant. She did it on iTunes, but everyone understands that whether it's Spotify, iTunes, whether it's Amazon Music, whatever thing you use, you can now use Spotify to just mean music streaming and whatever platform you choose. So that's one thing to consider. And on the podcasting, you guys know how I feel, which is that this business is becoming very, very flooded. The market is becoming very crowded. But we had this debate either earlier this week or last week, and our colleague Melody Hom, who's usually on in this hour, was saying that I'm not necessarily right about that, and that there's still new people to pull in who haven't yet found a podcast that pulls their attention, and maybe something like the DC Comics podcast is going to be what gets them. Maybe it's Joe Rogan, maybe it's the New York Times. There's still some opportunity. Of course, we have from the podcasting industry rolling through our live shows. I asked them the same question. Isn't it flooded and overcrowded? And of course, they're talking their book. It behooves them to say no, but they all say, no, it isn't overcrowded yet. So maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, I think, and again, not to go back through the conversation or the debate that you and I had last week, Dan, but basically, the world of radio that I think people are framing podcasts around, that's a world where time is not infinite. I'm in my car. I can only listen to one radio station, and I have to be in Boston or New York to get the station, so on and so forth. Spotify, you can be anywhere in the world. You can listen to any podcast at any time. Obviously, you're not going to listen to, well, you might listen to old episodes of The Daily for New York Times. But the point is, that's a niche part of podcasting. You have to listen to it now. Most of it is fairly evergreen, either scripted or long form interview type content. And I think Spotify's bet is basically, if we build out the library, then we can start to really aggregate customers on top of that content base. I mean, this is essentially what Netflix has done. And there's all kinds of reasons why they're different, but I think the playbook is mostly the same. And again, I think, as I noted at the top of the segment, just surprising how much the street has fallen in love with this stock. And if you look at Corona plays, I mean, we did a segment back in March, I think, about how podcast listening was tanking during this time. And yet now Spotify is one of the hottest stocks during this period. Again, as I mentioned, it's at a record high. And so I think that is part of the surprise with this story as well.
And guys, one quick thing I'll also acknowledge on the question of whether or not it's overcrowded. We were in the car the other day because my wife is a big fan of the Barstool Sports podcast, Part of My Take. And one of the recent guests was Rob Lowe. And Rob Lowe was on that podcast pumping and promoting his own new podcast that's coming. And Rob Lowe kind of acknowledged in his interview, he said, a lot of celebrities and actors like me have a podcast now, and people do really need another one of them. But, well, if you are interested in hearing me do a conversation with Chris Pratt, and no one can interview Chris Pratt like I can because we're friends, then this podcast is for you. And I joked to my wife, well, I'm not interested in that, but a lot of people are. And, Dax Shepard, another example, interesting interviews with fellow actors. And, I think to some extent it's probably unfair to lump them all together. And if you're a fan of a certain person, you probably want to listen to their podcast religiously.
I would listen to that podcast if it was in character as Chris Traeger and Andy Dwyer, but I'm not sure that I want to listen to like IRL Rob Lowe and IRL Chris Pratt. But if we did like a Parks and Rec spinoff where they talk to each other in character, I might be more interested in something.
Well, the name of the pod is Literally with Rob Lowe.
I was just going to say there had to be a tie-in of some sort. There's a whole thing online where Mike Schur talks about how Rob Lowe is basically just that character. He's just being himself. But we'll save the Parks and Rec kind of fandom for another time.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.